Hey everybody, I'm Ryan the Nature Gamer. Welcome back to my channel, and today we're continuing our read aloud of Budding Prospects by T.C. Boyle. Today we're going to read Chapter 2. And forgive me if I cough a little bit throughout there. I have some drink next to me to help prevent that. But if I do, I'm getting over a little sickness. So please forgive me for that. So here we are, Chapter 2 of Budding Prospects by T.C. Boyle. Let me just take a drink. Chapter 2. There was nothing in my early upbringing to indicate a life of crime. I wasn't beaten or orphaned or abandoned. I didn't hang out on street corners with a cigarette in my mouth and a stiletto in my pocket. I wasn't mentally disfigured from years in reformatory or morally and physically sapped as a result of shooting smack on pigeon shit encrusted stoops in the ghetto. No, I was a child of the middle class, nurtured on tiger's milk and TV dinners and Oreo mycin, until I towered over my parents like some big-footed freak of another species, like a cuckoo raised by sparrows. I knew algebra, appreciated Verdi, ate veal marsala, sushi, and escargot, and selected a good bottle of wine. My record, if not spotless, was tainted only by the most venial infractions. There had been the usual traffic violations, an unfortunate incident on the steps of the Justice Department during one of the Washington marches, and a fine for carrying an open container on the streets of Lake George. But that was about it. Certainly, like any other solid citizen with inalienable rights, I broke laws regularly, purchasing and consuming controlled substances, driving at a steady 65 on freeways, fornicating in waterbeds and hot tubs, micturating in public, knowingly and willingly being in the presence of persons who, etc., etc. On the other hand, I didn't litter, extort, burgle, batter, assault, rape, or murder. At 31, endowed with the cautiousness and conservatism of maturity, I could arguably consider myself, if not a pillar, then at least a flying buttress of bourgeois society. Still, 2 hours after Vogelsang had left, and despite a weariness that verged on narcolepsy and a steady blinding Niagara of a rainstorm, I was on my way to Lake Tahoe to take my first irretrievable steps into the lower depths. At 4 a.m. I pulled into a truck stop and sat hunched over the counter on a cracked vinyl stool, spooned up with grease and eggs, listened to moronic country-inflected yodeling from the jukebox, and drank 8 cups of coffee that tasted of death and metal. The rain had stopped, and I watched myself in the dark, water-flecked window for a moment, my face lit by neon and the flashing lights of semis, and saw that my eyes glared and cheeks bristled with a look of criminality, or tiredness. Then I left some money on the counter, stumbled out to my rust-spotted Toyota, and drove up on the hill to where dawn was flaring over South Tahoe. I missed a turnoff for Chernisky's place, everything uniform at this altitude. Snow on the ground like a fungus, trees as alike as a forest of dicks on pencils. Without thinking, I swerved to cut a U-turn and was nearly annihilated by a California highway patrolman doing about 90 on urgent business. The thing that saved my life in the patrolman's was the super siren with which the CHP car was equipped. That's the sort of deadly heart-seizing klaxon fire trucks use when approaching intersections. I was halfway through my illegal U-turn, horizontal to the flow of traffic and already obstructing an entire lane, oblivious to sirens, lights, the possibility of runway logging trucks, when the klaxon slapped me like an angry hand. My foot went to the floor, tires squealed, brake drums clapped like cymbals, and the Toyota lurched to a halt as the CHP cruiser careened past the front bumper, inches to spare. As he passed, the patrolman gave me a quick, sharp look of murderous intensity, a look that said, "I would shoot you here now, no questions," as automatically as I would shoot a rattlesnake or a junkyard rat, but for this appalling emergency that requires my dedication, bravery, and expertise. And then he was gone, a pair of taillights skidding around a corner in the distance. Mortified, I pulled the car around just in time to avoid the shrieking ambulance for which the cruiser had been running interference, humbly shifted gears, signaled, and swung onto the wet, glistening back blacktop road that snaked into the trees to Chernisky's place. Almost instantly there was a thump, the wheel was jerked from my hand, and the car veered wildly for the shoulder in a clutch of nasty russet barked pines. I'd been driving since I was 16, and groggy though I was, rose to the occasion, snatching the wheel back and regaining control without missing a beat. Calmly, almost clinically, I noted the cause of my minor emergency. There was a groove in the road. A deep, insistent gash that seemed to the right-hand lane like a furrow, as if some absent-minded sodbuster had neglected to lift the plow blade while rumbling home on his tractor. I would have thought nothing more of it but for the fact that the groove seemed to be going in the same direction I was, turn for turn. I followed it down Alpine Way to the end, left on Lederhosen Lane, left again on Chalet Drive, and then amazingly into Phil's driveway and right on up to the bumper of his sagging '62 Cadillac. Phil's house, his two-story chalet cabin / condo / duplex, was silent, the windows dark. It was 7 a.m., and the early light had been absorbed into the low ceiling of ropey cloud the color of charcoal. I swung out of the car and examined Phil's Cadillac. It was pitched forward like a crippled stegosaur, tail fins in the air, and the right front fender and a portion of the hood had been crumpled like tinfoil. Looking closer, I saw that not only the tire was gone on that side, but the brake drum and wheel as well. The car was resting on a sheared splinter of axle, from the apex of which the groove raveled out up the driveway and down the blacktop road out to the highway. The engine was still warm. No one responded to my knock. This was no surprise. I hadn't really expected a formal reception. At this hour, Phil and his roommates would be entering the first leaden phase of deep sleep, having closed the bars in California and roamed the casinos of State Line, Nevada, until dawn. The door was unlatched. I stepped in, sleeping bag under my arm, thinking to curl up on the couch, wake when they did, and put my proposition to Phil over breakfast. It was colder inside than out, and the place had a familiar subterranean smell to it, a smell of underwear and socks worn too long, of stale beer, primitive cooking, and a species of mold that thrives under adverse conditions. The shades were drawn, but there was light enough to distinguish generic shapes: TV, armchair, couch, bicycle, lamp, log. I groped my way to the couch, unfurled the sleeping bag, and sat down. This was a mistake, as my buttocks made contact with flesh and bone rather than Herculon and styrofoam, and I began to intuit that the couch was already occupied. A quick lithe form jerked up to shove at my chest, rake my face, and gasp a few emphatic obscenities. "No," the voice said. It was feminine. Half rasped, half shrieked. "I've had enough. Now get off." I found myself on the floor, muttering apologies. Then the light exploded in the room as if it had come on with a blast of noise, and I was staring up at a tableau vivant. The girl's white naked arm poised at the lamp switch, her furious squinting eyes, high breasts, the lavender comforter slipped to her waist. "Who the hell are you?" she hissed. "Felix," I whispered, somehow feeling as if I were covering up the truth. "Phil's friend." She glared at me as if she hadn't heard. Her hair was a cracked fluff of peroxide blonde. Her eyes were green as glass marble. She had no eyebrows. I watched her nipples harden in the cold. "I'm looking for Phil," I said. "Who?" The tone was barely under control, the upward swing of the interrogative a scarcely suppressed snarl. "Listen, mister," drawing the comforter up under her armpits, "you better get your ass out of here, or I'll—" She never finished the phrase, gesturing vaguely and then fumbling for a cigarette on the coffee table. This is what an inept rapist must feel like, I thought, or a cat burglar who catches the mother superior with her habit down. Despite myself, I found I had an erection. "Phil," I repeated. "Phil Chernisky, the guy that rents this place?" Suddenly the rage went out of her face. She looked up at me over her cigarette as she lit it, shook out the match, and took a deep drag. Eyebrowless, she looked like Humpty Dumpty or a man on the moon. Too much pale, unbroken space between eyes and hair. I watched her exhale a blue cloud of smoke. "Oh, Phil," she said, wearily, as if she just experienced a revelation that hadn't seemed worth the effort. "He's in jail." Take a drink. Phil and I had been close all our lives. Our parents had been friends before we were born. We'd attended the same elementary and secondary schools, had quit separate colleges in the same year. Phil went west. I stayed in New York. I got married, went back to school, dropped out, found a job selling life insurance to pensioners with trembling hands, and hated myself for it. Phil made a brief splash in L.A., Pasadena actually, as Phil Yonkers, sculptor primitif. He roamed junkyards with the avidity and determination of a housewife at a Macy's white sale, collecting fascinating slabs of rusted iron, discarded airplane wings, scalloped fenders, anvils, stoves, washing machines, useless but intrinsically edifying cogs, springs and engine parts from obsolete heavy machinery. These he would weld together in random configurations, hose down to encourage oxidation, and offer for sale. I remember a brochure he once sent me an advertisement of his first and last show. The cover featured a poorly reproduced photo of the artist, the sagging pompadour, pointed nose, emaciated frame, and wandering eye. Grinning in the lee of a gargantuan iron monster that dripped oil like saliva and seemed to be composed around the gap-toothed shovel of an earth mover and a set of pistons frozen at descending intervals. The text indicated that the piece was titled Madonna and Child, and compared the artist to Herm Smith and Kienholz. Unfortunately, the show had to be canceled the afternoon it opened, owing to irremediable structural damage to the building that housed the gallery. The immense crushing weight of Phil's pieces, combined with the exuberance of his friends and acquaintances who turned the sedate, champagne-sipping gathering into a foot-stomping celebration of rock and roll in the sculptor's muse, fractured several floor joists and collapsed a section of the foundation. Phil did manage to sell one piece. 3 table saws welded together beneath a corona of conjoined lug wrenches molded in the shape of a butterfly's rings, to a retired tool and die maker from Boyle Heights. Then he went into the restaurant business. The restaurant business, as far as I can see, harbors a greater assortment of misfits, bon vivants, congenital crazies, and food, drug, and alcohol abusers than any other métier, with the possible exception of the medical. Phil, disappointed in his effort to combine artistic expression and pecuniary reward, was only too willing to give himself up to the pharmaceutical oblivion of the world of waiters and blancheuses. He stood before a blazing grill at a steakhouse in Boulder, washed dishes at a Himalayan restaurant in Montpelier, tended a bar in Maui, Park City, and Aspen, bisected oysters on Bourbon Street. For a time, like most restaurant people, he attained restaurant nirvana, opening his own place. He borrowed money from his parents, his friends, relatives whose existence he'd forgotten, went partners with a savvy Greek in his mid-50s, opened an impeccable haute cuisine eatery in the suburbs of Sacramento, and went broke in 9 months. Bad location, he said, but he later confided to me that the savvy Greek had been skimming money off the top. When I came to town that early morning with the proposition Vogelsang had made me, Phil was employed as a dishwasher at the Tahoe Teriyaki, and, as I learned from the girl on the couch, temporarily incarcerated. I blinked at her 2 or 3 times. My eyes felt as if they were bleeding. I staggered to my feet, dragging the sleeping bag like the corpse of a dead enemy, fumbled my way out the door, across the blackened and pissed-over snow, and back into the Toyota. 10 minutes later, I pulled into the courthouse lot where the El Dorado County Sheriff's Department maintained its drunk tank and holding facility. If the stereotypical desk sergeant is loose of jowl, corpulent, balding, and non-communicative, the man I encountered at the Sheriff's Department didn't break any new ground. A cardboard container of coffee steamed on the counter before him. His eyes were as puffed as a prize fighter's, and his loose jowls were reddened with 1,000 tiny nicks and abrasions that gave evidence of a recent and clumsy shave, with one of the new ultra-modern reclining heads skin whittlers reinvented by Gillette, Bic, and the rest each month. I wear a beard myself. "Excuse me, officer," I said. "I'd like to put up bail for someone you might be holding here." I felt like Raskolnikov in Myshkin's office, born guilty in perpetuity, guilty of everything from not honoring and obeying my parents to adolescent masturbation and stealing cigars, to the larger and more heinous crimes of adulthood. I wanted to blurt it all out, confess in spate, but be shriven and forgiven. Uniforms did that to me. The desk sergeant said nothing. I repeated myself with a slight variation and began to think wildly of all the possible permutations of this simple communication I might have to sift through until I hit the right one, the combination that would set clicking the tumblers of the policeman's speech centers when I hit on revealing the name of the incarceree after whom I was inquiring. "Chernisky," I said. "Philip T." Still nothing. The man was immovable, emotionless, a jade Buddha serenely contemplating some quintessential episode of a TV police show, perhaps one in which a mild-mannered desk sergeant is moved to heroics by the sick and sad state of society, leaping out from behind his deceptive mask of lethargy to pound drunks, pleaders, crooks, and loophole-manipulating lawyers back into the dirt where they belonged. I tried again, this time making it a question. "Phil Chernisky, brought in this morning? Public intoxication?" The thick neck swiveled like a lazy Susan. The blue beads of the eyes hesitated on me with a look of hatred or impassivity, I couldn't tell which, and continued past me to focus on an object over my left shoulder. The officer's next motion was almost magical, so abrupt and yet so conservative of energy. His chins compressed briefly and then relaxed. I looked over my shoulder to a wooden bench flanked by a battered water cooler and a forlorn flag. "You want me to wait over there?" I said, my voice unnaturally loud, as if in compensation for his rigorous silence. I watched his eyes for the answer in the way one watches the eyes of a stroke victim for life. They squeezed shut slowly, tenderly, then flashed open again. He could have been a dragon disturbed in its sleep, before drifting down to contemplate the steam rising from the cup. I turned obsequiously, dodging leather-booted, black-jacketed, hip-slung patrolmen who stomped and jangled across the scuffed linoleum floor and started for the bench. Halfway there, pausing to maneuver around a fleshy colossus who stood yawning and scratching before the water cooler, I was suddenly arrested by a summons at my back, a croak really, like some barely breathed disclosure of the oracle. $65, the voice whispered. I gave him 3 20s and a 5. As the crisp folded bills passed between us, I felt we detained some sort of brotherhood, a moment of truth and accord, and I took advantage of it to ask the sergeant if he could possibly tell me when the prisoner might be released. His eyes were glass. 5 fat fingers lay in the bills like dead things. When I saw that no answer was forthcoming, I wheeled round, irritated, and blundered into an officer dressed in the uniform of the California Highway Patrol, replete with mirror shades, wear-mocked boots, and outsized gun belt. "Oh, excuse me," I gasped, regaining my balance and letting the final vowel trail off in a little bleat of urbane laughter meant not only to implicate him in a shared responsibility for our collision and the foibles of the human condition in general, but to assure him that it had been purely accidental and that, just as he would think no more of it, neither would I. I was grinning like an idiot. He was not grinning. The shades, in fact, seemed to draw his eyes together in a single horrific cyclopean mask that rendered the rest of his face expressionless. He stood there to a second, rocking back and forth on his heels, then tore off the sunglasses. "You," he snarled. "Me?" The smile had gone sick on my face. I recognized him in that instant. The guilt I felt on entering the station house infesting me like a cancer, my mind racing through the minuscule store of legal knowledge I'd accumulated under duress in the past, thinking moving violation, his word against mine, judicium perium aut leges terrae. All for naught. He threw me against the wall in an explosion of shoulders and arms, and began to shout in my face. "What in Christ's name do you want here?" he spat, his voice breaking on the expletive. The room had gone silent. All the others, big, beefy local cops, looked up from their coffee and clipboards and took an involuntary step or two toward us, like a defensive backfield converging on the ball carrier. I began to offer an explanation when my antagonist bellowed for me to shut up. His hands pressed my elbows to the wall. He was breathing hard. His upper lip was wet, and his eyes shone with a fierce, fanatical glow of righteousness one recognized in the eyes of Muslim zealots. A black plastic plate over his shirt pocket identified him as Officer Jerpak. There in the police station, up against the wall, physical harm and worse shouting me in the face, I found a moment to indulge myself in the luxury of philosophy, to acknowledge my debt to empiricism, causality, and John Locke. A mere 8 hours ago, I'd been padding around the apartment in my bathrobe, listening to the Rain and Stravinsky preparatory to turning in. All was right with the world, and then the grail in the form of $500,000 sashayed through the room, and I ducked out into the rain, inserted the key in the ignition of my Toyota, welcomed the answering shriek of the enervated engine, and drove here to Tahoe, where I had managed to make an enemy of the most desperate and lawless sort, a cop, simply because I'd been in the wrong place at the wrong time. Suddenly I felt indescribably weary. "Get your fucking hands off me," I said. Officer Jerpak responded by spinning me around like an Indian club and slamming me back into the wall in the classic shakedown position. "Spread 'em," he snarled, patting me down with all the finesse of a middleweight working out with a body bag. He gave me elaborate consideration to the general area, all the while breathing obscenities over my shoulder. "You fuck," he whispered, his voice trembling at the breaking point. "You stupid-ass dildo motherfucker. You nearly killed me out there. You know that? Huh? His breathing was furious, incendiary. I could hear the hardened snot rattling in his nostrils. All I wanted at that moment was to swell Lystagonian proportions of him and murder him, pound the other beef eaters to hamburger, set fire to the station house, and go home to bed. Instead, I listened to the harsh jangle of handcuffs relax under his grip. "You know who was in that ambulance?" he demanded, leaning into me with one broad hand while he fumbled with the other for the cuffs. Huh? It was a quiz. That's what it was. 20 questions. Hit the jackpot and win 2 free tickets to the martial arts expedition. Merv Griffin, that's who. Shithead. Merv Griffin. There was a reverence in his voice. He could have been naming the Pope's mother or the winner of the Miss America pageant. Reverence and outrage. The man took 22 stitches in his thumb. He could have bled to death. Suddenly he was shouting again. You hear me? Huh? My hands were torn from the wall and forced behind me. There was the cold bite of the cuffs, the furious breathing, and then, just when things had begun to look grim, the soft restrained tones of a second voice, Deus Ex Machina. John, take it easy. I looked over my shoulder. Officer Robb had joined us. He had the head the size of a beach ball, crimson face, white hair. His voice was just as soothing and softly modulated as his shrieks. John, he repeated, the man hasn't done anything. He's here to bail somebody out is all. Jerpak wheeled around on him. I don't give a shit. There was a whining edge to his voice, the young hothead reluctantly deferring to a higher authority, and I realized in that instant Jerpak was no older than I. It was a jolt. I could have submitted to a middle-aged cop, and Officer Robb and the mute desk sergeant could have rationalized the father's figures needed to assert himself and all that, but with a Koval like Jerpak, the experience was humiliating, deeply shameful. A whole series of childhood episodes suddenly flooded into my mind. I saw every physical confrontation in a flash, tallied up the wins and losses, counted the times I'd backed down, conjured the faces of the class bullies and extortionists as if they were snapshots in a riffled deck. No older than I. I jerked my neck at Officer Robb. You don't get these cuffs off in 2 seconds, I'll sue everybody in this place for false arrest, and I was so wrought up I nearly sobbed the word brutality. Officer Robb had a soft, puffy hand on Officer Jerpak's upper arm. They moved off a pace, and the older man was whispering in the younger's ear like a lover. I watched Jerpak. He looked like a cobra having his hood stroked. When I opened my mouth, Robb glanced at me as if I were a bit taking awful, something of curiosity perhaps, but for all that worth no more than a cursory glance, and then moved off across the room and down a pitted corridor, Jerpak in tow. I was left standing in the middle of the room, hands manacled behind my back. Every cop in the place was staring at me. After a moment's hesitation, a wizened little deputy crossed the room, released the cuffs, and told me in a quiet voice to wait on the bench. I was exhausted, confused, furious. I eased down on the bench, breathing in gasps, adrenaline bubbling in my veins like grease in a deep fryer. 2 minutes later, I was snoring. Let's take a drink. I was awakened by a pressure on my arm and a voice repeating my name. It was Phil. He looked as if he just emerged from the third tier of the opium den. His eyes drooping, shirt torn, hair wedged to one side of his head, and he was smiling the fragile smile of a man with a terminal headache. Shit, he said, breaking into a grin. And then he repeated himself 6 or 7 times, alternating the exclamation in my name like a cheerleader trying to rouse a stand of lethargic fans. I blinked twice. There were pins and needles in my feet. All the fearsome G-forces of the spinning planet tugged at me as I rose wearily to exchange the black-slapping hug we used in a greeting ever since we saw Beau Jess together at the age of 14. Kid, I said. Then we stood there looking at each other for a moment, both of us grinning now, until Phil and he said he didn't know what I was doing in Tahoe, but I couldn't have come at a better time, and I happen to have another $65 on me. I did. I'd stuffed some bills in my wallet as I left San Francisco, $160 or so. 65 and 65 is 130. I was thinking as I reached for my wallet. Then that left me with nothing to eat on and an expired Shell card for gas. I asked him what he needed it for. Phil was rubbing his temples. He looked up at me out of bloodshot eyes and let the air whistle through his teeth. For Gesh. Who? Gesh, he's the new roommate. They've still got him back there, indicating the rear of the building, and I'd have to wait till the bank opens before I could bail him out. Crazy Eddie we're going to have to take up a collection for. Crazy Eddie was the third roommate. He'd been behind the wheel when the road insidiously narrowed into the triangular sign with the insistent arrow had sprung up in the front of the bumper. Crazy Eddie flattened the sign and then took out 3 or 4 of the steel posts behind it before the right front wheel of Phil's Cadillac sheared off and the car spun to a halt. All 3 of them had been drinking and eating Quaaludes, and their judgment was gone. They pulled themselves out of the car to assess the damage and saw that they had annihilated the guardrail of a narrow bridge somewhere off the main road. Black trees stared down at them. Water hummed down under the bridge. Crazy Eddie expressed his regrets to Phil and offered his condolences with regard to the condition of the car. Phil asked him if he knew how to get home. Eddie replied in the affirmative, and they stumbled back into the car. Then he revved the engine and lurched out into the far lane, trailing sparks. The police followed the furrow to Phil's house, arrested Phil in the act of urinating against a tree, dragged the comatose guest from the back seat, and proceeded into the house, where they peeled Crazy Eddie from the girl on the couch and booked him for DWI and leaving the scene of an accident. Bail was $1,500. I see what you mean, I said, referring to Eddie's dilemma, counted out the $65 and watched Phil recount it for the mute desk sergeant. 10 minutes later, Guest staggered down the pitted hallway, an officer at his side. He was wearing a watch cap, a reindeer sweater, and a drooping khaki overcoat the Salvation Army might have rejected. A room full of cops, stenographers, fingerprint filers, minor functionaries, and shackled suspects watched Phil introduce us. I saw cheekbones cut like slashes, unfocused eyes, a stubble of beard. The overcoat concealed a big man, 200 pounds or more. There were nicotine stains in his teeth, and one of his eyebrows was divided by a white scar. I nodded, made a stab at a smile. Gesh was unsteady. He fell back on one heel, covered himself by grabbing my hand in a bleary soul shake, and murmured, "Aces, man." Outside it was snowing, dry white pellets sifting down with a hiss. We tramped silently across the white expanse of the parking lot, the wind in our faces, a line of smeared footprints snaking out behind us, and climbing the steps of the station house in mute incrimination. Guest jerked open the door of the Toyota and pitched headlong into the back seat. He was asleep at the time I cleared the snow from the windshield and thumped in beside Phil. My stomach was sour. My head ached. I wondered what in God's name I was doing in a snowstorm in Lake Tahoe at 8:30 in the morning. I glanced at Phil. He was grinning at me, his wandering eye so far out of alignment it could have been orbiting the socket. Then he began to laugh, a brain gasping, high-pitched shriek that choked on each breath, only to come back all the stronger on the next. I couldn't help myself. Delirium, hunger, sleep deprivation. Whatever triggered it, suddenly I was laughing along with him, roaring, beating the steering wheel, throwing my head back, struggling for control, and then looking at Phil and collapsing all over again. This was hilarious. The snow, the parked car, the police, all of it. "Phil," I gasped, my voice cracking with the absurdity of what I was about to say. "Phil, listen, how would you like," I broke off, laughter nagging like a cough, the sheer silliness of it. "How would you like to make $250,000? And that's the end of Chapter 2. Next time we'll read Chapter 3. This is Budding Prospects, and I'm Ryan the Nature Gamer, and thank you for joining me. Please like, comment, and subscribe to my channel, and let me know anything else you'd like to see. Have a wonderful day, and see you in the next video.